In the spring of 1720, a man walks into a crowded London coffee house, announces that he is raising capital for an undertaking of great advantage, and refuses to say what that undertaking actually is. By the following morning, he has collected £2,000 in deposits. Then he disappears. He was never seen again. And here's the thing, he was not the strangest scheme being sold that year. Not by a long way. In 1720, across Britain and France, millions of people handed their saving to strangers for promises that had no more substance than smoke. How did an entire civilization lose its mind in the same 12 months? And why 3 centuries later does it keep happening again? To understand 1720, you need to understand the world that made it possible. Europe had just fought one of its most expensive wars in living memory. The War of the Spanish Succession had dragged on for 13 years and left both Britain and France with debts so vast that governments struggled to pay even the interest. Britain's national debt stood at roughly £64 million, in a country where most workers earned a few pounds a year. France was in worse shape. Debt of that scale creates pressure, and pressure, eventually, creates desperation. In France, pressure fell on a Scottish gambler and financier named John Law. Law was a genuine intellectual, one of the first Europeans to seriously think through how paper money and banking could work. But he was also a convicted murderer who had escaped a London prison and reinvented himself on the continent. By 1716, he had charmed the regent of France into giving him control of a new state bank. Within 3 years, he effectively ran the entire French economy. In England, the pressure fell on the South Sea Company, a corporation founded in 1711, theoretically to trade with Spanish colonies in South America. Its actual trade was negligible. Spain permitted it 1 ship per year. But the company had made itself useful by absorbing a chunk of government debt, and now its directors saw a bigger opportunity. The opportunity was this. People with money were desperate to put it somewhere. People in power were desperate for capital. All that was needed was a story convincing enough to bring them together. In 1720, they told the story. John Law moved first. His scheme was, in its own way, elegant. He merged his bank with a trading company, the Mississippi Company, and gave it a monopoly over trade in France's vast Louisiana territory in North America. He then offered investors a way to swap their nearly worthless government bonds for shares in this glittering enterprise. Buy in, and you owned a piece of the new world. The share price responded immediately. In 1719, Law issued shares at 500 livres. By the end of that year, they were trading at 10,000 livres, a 20-fold increase in roughly 12 months. Ordinary citizens flooded into Paris, cobblers, priests, merchants, widows, camping in the streets near the Rue Campois, where shares were traded, desperate to buy. A hunchback reportedly made a small fortune renting his back as a writing desk to people signing stock certificates in the alley outside. Word crossed the channel. London watched Paris with the focused attention of someone watching a neighbor win a lottery. In Britain, the South Sea Company launched its own version of the scheme in early 1720. It offered to absorb the entire British national debt, some £30 million, in exchange for a monopoly on trade and a government annuity. Parliament passed the bill. The company then quietly bribed members of Parliament with shares they didn't have to pay for immediately, which they could sell once the price rose. Several of the king's mistresses received the same treatment. The stock price in January 1720 stood at £128 per share. By June, it had reached £890. As the fever spread, hundreds of copycat ventures launched in the same season. There were companies to drain the Irish bogs, companies to import walnut trees from Virginia, a company for the transmutation of quicksilver into a malleable metal. One raised £1 million for a wheel designed for perpetual motion. Another proposed to breed horses for improving church lands and could not explain why the church would want horses. And then there was the man in the coffee house, the one with the undertaking of great advantage. Nobody to know what it was. £2,000, gone by morning. The first cracks appeared in France. By January 1720, sharp-eyed investors began to notice that Law's paper money had expanded far beyond anything his company could realistically justify. The Mississippi Territory existed on maps, But the wealth being promised bore no relationship to what a largely undeveloped wilderness could actually produce. Large speculators began quietly converting their shares into land, gold, and property. Real things. Things you could hold. Law responded by doing what governments do when they are losing. He made the crisis illegal. He abolished the use of gold and silver as payment, imposed severe penalties on hoarding, and offered rewards to informants who turned in neighbors concealing coin. He tried to stabilize the share price through direct intervention, ordering the bank to buy shares at a fixed. It didn't work. Confidence, once it starts to leave, does not respond to commands. By December 1720, Mississippi Company shares had collapsed from 10,000 livres to 1,000. By 1721, they were at 500. John Law, who had briefly controlled the monetary system of one of the world's great powers, fled France in disguise. He died in Venice in 1729, nearly penniless, selling paintings to cover his debts. In England, the unraveling came faster. The South Sea Company, alarmed by competing bubble companies, pushed Parliament to pass the Bubble Act in June 1720, requiring all new joint stock companies to have royal authorization. The irony was total. The company used legislation against speculation to eliminate its competitors while continuing to be the most speculative enterprise in the country. It didn't save them. In August 1720, South Sea shares peaked at £1,000. Then insiders began to sell. When that movement became visible, as it always does, confidence broke. By September, the price was falling. By December, shares were back to approximately £124. An investor who bought at the peak had lost nearly 90% of their money. The social fallout was immediate and severe. Riots broke out. Suicides spiked. Families who had mortgaged everything found themselves with nothing. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London for corruption. Several directors of the South Sea Company had their estates confiscated by Parliament. And then there was Isaac Newton. Newton had invested early and, correctly identifying the mania for what it was, sold his shares at a profit of around £7,000. Then he watched the price continue to climb. He bought back in, near the peak. He lost approximately £20,000, the equivalent of several million pounds today. He reportedly said afterwards, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." He allegedly refused to hear the words South Sea Company spoken in his presence for the rest of his life. The easy explanation for all of this is greed. And greed was certainly present, but it doesn't explain why intelligent, sober people, Newton among them, fell for it too. The better explanation is structural. Both the Mississippi bubble and the South Sea bubble were, at their core, debt conversion schemes. Governments owed money they couldn't repay. Clever intermediaries offered to absorb that debt in exchange for trading monopolies and permission to issue shares. The shares then became the vehicle for new money creation. In Law's case, literally, since his bank printed currency backed by the shares. In Britain's case, through the inflating of stock prices that allowed everyone to feel richer on paper. The problem is that this only works as long as confidence holds. There was no underlying cash flow to justify 10,000 livres per Mississippi share, or £1,000 per South Sea share. The Mississippi Territory was wilderness. The South Sea Company's actual trading rights generated negligible revenue. The numbers were fiction, and they could only remain fiction as long as enough people chose to believe them. The psychological legacy was real and lasting. France emerged from 1720 with a deep suspicion of paper money and banking that persisted for generations. While Britain went on to develop the most sophisticated financial system in the world, France did not establish a central bank until Napoleon founded the Banque de France in 1800, 80 years later. The wreckage of a single speculative year shaped the financial architecture of two nations for a century. 3 lessons worth taking from 1720. The first, when a financial instrument's value depends entirely on the next buyer paying more than you did, it is a speculation, not an investment. The South Sea Company produced almost nothing. The Mississippi Company's actual revenues were marginal. Their share prices were sustained by collective expectation, the belief that someone else would always pay more. The moment that belief wavered, there was nothing underneath. We saw the same dynamic in the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s. In the mortgage securities of 2007, in certain corners of the cryptocurrency market, the asset changes, the mechanism doesn't. The second, intelligence is not a reliable defense against collective delusion. Newton is the most striking example history gives us. A man who understood the bubble, sold correctly, then bought back in because watching others get rich became unbearable. The technical term for this is groupthink. The human term is something more familiar. When everyone around you appears to be getting wealthy, staying out requires a psychological resilience that most people, including geniuses, don't possess on demand. The third, and this is the one that gets missed, the governments involved were not passive bystanders. They needed the scheme. British MPs were bribed with shares. The French regent gave law extraordinary powers because France was essentially bankrupt, and law appeared to have a solution. When institutions with enormous power have a stake in an asset price staying high, they will use that power to keep it there, right up until the moment they can't. At that point, ordinary investors are holding the wreckage, and the powerful are negotiating their estates. That is not a historical peculiarity. It is a pattern. What the year 1720 really tells us is that the oldest scams in history aren't the most exotic ones. They're the ones dressed up in the language of the moment. New World Trade in 1720. New economy stocks in 1999. New paradigm assets in 2021. The costume changes. The logic underneath stays the same. If you want to follow this thread forward to the next great collapse, one that was bigger, more interconnected, and somehow even more predictable, the 2008 mortgage crisis is the place to go. I'll see you there.